reasons is because most of you don't know, I'm a big fan of tattoos. I love tattoos. You can't see any of them, mainly because my mom is here. She's not a big fan of them. But I have about 20 tattoos throughout my body. And every once in a while, if I'm at a beach or hanging out outside and I don't have my shirt on, people come up to me and say, you know, you have beautiful art. And I'm never sure what to say in those moments. Because it feels weird. I almost feel guilty saying thank you, because it's not my art. And I just sat there while someone more talented than me put their beautiful artwork onto my body. And so I feel weird accepting gratitude for what I feel like is not my work. And I feel similarly every time I accept any sort of award or gratitude for the work that I do. Because everything that I do, everything that I say, I'm just repeating something that I heard someone smarter than me say. There's not a single workshop that I do that goes by without me quoting a story from David Hartso or Erica Chenoweth, who's back there. There's a lot of people in this room that I'm constantly sharing the lessons that I've learned from. As well as Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who taught me Kingian nonviolence, and Dr. King, who taught him nonviolence, Reverend James Lawson, and Gandhi, and Tolstoy, and the Buddha, and Jesus before them. So I feel like I'm just a conduit for this work. And so I, as an individual, I'm obviously incredibly grateful and humbled to accept this award, but I really want to accept this award as just that, as a conduit, as just one of millions and millions of people who have come through this work. And I'm just one piece of that living bridge. The majority of the work I do these days, as Trina just said, is with incarcerated communities throughout California. And I was actually in county jail yesterday. And I was with a group of men reading A Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, which is an essay by Dr. Martin Luther King. And in that essay, he talks about the Fellowship for Reconciliation. He talks about A.J. Musty. And so when we got to that part, the men were like, well, what's with the Fellowship? What do they do? Who is that organization? And who is this A.J. Musty guy? And so I guess I want us to keep in mind that as we're here tonight, there's a group of men sitting in a jail cell in San Francisco who's here with us in spirit because we talked about you all last night, that we were going to be here talking about them and talking about this work. Wow. And also that the work of the fellowship, the ripple effects, the inspiration, the lessons, the teachings go beyond walls that you couldn't even imagine. And all those people inside a San Francisco County jail thinking about the work of the Fellowship for Reconciliation right now. I want to share a couple of quick stories and offer a couple of quick challenges before I'm out of here. One of the biggest challenges that I find in my work is that the word nonviolence, especially in a place like Oakland or in the county jails and the prison systems, has become a dirty word. And one of the things that I always say in my workshops is that the idea that nonviolence means to not be violent is the biggest misunderstanding and the most dangerous misunderstanding that exists of the concept of nonviolence. A few years ago, I was taking a nap, and this is a story that I've shared a lot. I was taking a nap in my apartment, and I was woken up by some commotion outside, and there was a couple who were arguing. And I live in a neighborhood where people screaming is almost a daily occurrence, so I was just trying to go back to sleep. And this fight kept escalating, and it kept escalating, kept getting louder, and I finally got up out of my bed and looked down the window, and there was a woman on the ground who was getting beat. And she was screaming for help. And so I jumped up out of my bed and put on my shoes, ran downstairs, I opened up the gate, I ran across the street because they had gone across the street by this point, it was still going on, and I broke up this fight. And in all the time that it took me to get down there, about 15 of my neighbors had heard the commotion and come outside, and they were just watching this woman get beat, not doing anything to help. And my argument is always that all of my neighbors who were just watching this woman get beat were practicing non-violence. They were not violent. Right? And so this idea that non-violence simply means to not be violent is so dangerous because it allows people to think non-violence is a passive thing. When Dr. King taught us that nonviolence isn't about not being violent, but it's about taking a stand against violence. And it's not about what not to do as much as it's about what to do in the face of violence and how we're going to face and confront and transform violence and injustice. Right? So my first challenge to you all is to never hyphenate the word nonviolence again. Right? Because once you put the hyphen in there, it changes the word into an adjective, and that is a very dangerous adjective. And also, this understanding of nonviolence leads to a very dangerous misunderstanding of the concept of peace that Trina was just talking about from an article that I wrote about the peace that was going on in Baltimore after the Freddie Gray killing. The idea of negative peace was described by Dr. King when a woman named Afrin Lucy became the first black student ever to go to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And the first day she was on campus, there were riots. People burnt crosses, broke windows, a mob surrounded the car she was traveling in. And so the school kicked her out. They expelled her. They said, your presence is causing all of this violence and you need to leave. The next day, she wasn't on campus, so the riots had stopped. And the local newspaper ran a headline that said, things are quiet in Tuscaloosa today. There is peace on the campus of the University of Alabama. Because the violence had stopped, because the riots had stopped. And it's this understanding, or this misunderstanding of peace simply as the absence of violence that allows us to justify going to war to create peace. Because if we just kill all the bad people, then we can have peace. Right? Same thing with mass incarceration. If we just lock up all the bad people, then we'll have peace. Same thing with the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement today. If all the protesters would just stay quiet and stop yelling, then we would have peace in our communities. But like it was mentioned, we know that peace is a messy process. Right? Dr. King said that peace is not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And the path to justice is a messy process. We need to keep in mind that Dr. King was arrested multiple times for disturbing the peace. Right? Oftentimes, the path to justice requires us to disturb complacency and to disturb the calm and the negative peace that is so prevalent in our society. And so my second challenge may be a little bit harder because I want to say something to disturb the complacency that oftentimes exists in nonviolent circles, in nonviolent movements. Knowing that Dr. King said a lot of things that didn't make him very popular. I hope that's not the case, but another challenge that I have in my work, especially working with young people of color and in the prison systems, is that the moment the word nonviolence comes out of my mouth, people dismiss it and say, oh, that's for white people, right? And when I look around this room, I can see why some people would think that, which is why I'm so grateful that FOR is investing in bringing more young people and more people of color to these spaces. That, believe me, the moment I walked out of that car today when I got here, that's the first thing that I noticed, is that there were more people of color, and that's so important, but it's not enough. Right? We need to keep pushing. And we need to remind ourselves that when we think of nonviolent movements throughout history, we think of the civil rights movement, we think of the independence movement in India, we think of the farm workers movement, that the communities most directly impacted by systemic violence have always been at the leadership. And we need to ensure that we're continuing to allow those communities to step into leadership roles so that we can continue that legacy. And the last thing I want to say is just a quick word on reconciliation, because that is, after all, why we're here, celebrating 100 years of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I oftentimes get asked the question in my trainings, what are my thoughts on violence as self-defense? And I've come to this conclusion that violence can be very effective in keeping you alive. And it can be very effective in keeping your community alive if it's facing annihilation, and there's great value in that. But violence can never create reconciliation. Right? Violence can never create beloved community. And if our ultimate goal is beloved community, then at some point we need to use a force more sustainable than violence. Because we know that violence might keep my body safe temporarily, but it can't create relationships, it can't create beloved community. And in fact, if we lose sight of the fact that reconciliation is our ultimate goal, I always argue that the KKK can use nonviolent tactics to push its agenda. What makes our work different is that our ultimate goal is reconciliation. Our ultimate goal is the creation of beloved community, which is a community with justice for all people. And so I'm honored and humbled again to accept this award tonight. and to recommit myself to that path of creating beloved community. I want to challenge everyone here to go home to your local chapters, to your local organizations, and ask yourselves, if you support Black Lives Matter, what does it mean for that to be more than just a hashtag? And what does it mean to empower young people, not as the leaders of tomorrow, but as the leaders of today, to empower communities of color and to continue to push forward to reconciliation and beloved community. So thank you so much for having me back. I look forward to spending